Good to have you, Sandile. I'm glad we can have this conversation.
Good morning to you, Diane, and your viewers. Thank you.
More and more voices and writings on the appalling state of South Africa's infrastructure. Let's begin by I suppose, defining infrastructure. What is meant by that, and where is the problem?
Infrastructure are all those things that humans have created to support the life of households, the lives and activities of businesses. This will take a physical form like roads, dams, or services like telecommunications, transportation, and so on and so forth, hospitals, and so on and so forth. So those are the things that are here that we have created as humans here on Earth to support our life here on Earth. And when we then say the infrastructure is in a bad state, in South Africa, there is a system for evaluating the state of infrastructure, and that system evaluates infrastructure from a grade A to a grade E. So a grade A would be infrastructure that performs according to how it was designed. It is close to 100% condition of functionality. E is failed infrastructure. And the general infrastructure of South Africa is in condition D, which is at the risk of failure right now.
Yeah. I mean, this report basically saying, and this is the truth, I mean, in any country, the most basic relationship that residents have with the state is through the use of public services and utilities like public roads, schools, clinics, receiving water, sanitation, electricity services. That's it. I mean, every time I drive to work, I throw out a word that I shouldn't be throwing out because I've got this massive pothole or two that I have to dodge, and that already just gets you going. So I mean, in my head, I know what the summation of the country's current state of infrastructure is, but what does it say in the report? I mean, what is it looking like?
In the report, basically, what you will find is that if you talk about roads, the only entity that seems to have managed somehow to keep roads in good order is SANRAL, which is the national highways, your N3s, your N4s, N12s, and so on. The provincial segment of government is relatively poor. Its ratings are poor. And by the way, there's no infrastructure in South Africa that achieves an A. So the highest that is ever achieved is a B. So people like probably the airport company would be close to a B in terms of keeping the airports up and so on. And our commercial ports are relatively in the middle C to a B in that range. But when you talk about public schools, you talk about public schools, public hospitals, you are talking D's there. So generally, the condition of infrastructure in South Africa is in that sort of range. And let me also add that 75% of the roads in South Africa are actually gravel roads. On top of that, a lot of the gravel roads, probably more than 90%, are in grade E, which means it's failed infrastructure.
Well, that in a nutshell is exactly it, failed infrastructure. I mean, the report saying even though the state may have funding processes that require greater capacity embedded within the public sector to control, to implement and manage, does the state have that capacity?
The state does not have that capacity in a number of ways. Number one, the extent of vacancies in the engineering department or engineering sections of the SOEs, the state-owned companies, and the state-owned companies account for about 50% of the budget of infrastructure in South Africa, and they do not have the correct skills. That is not necessarily to say that the existing engineers in South Africa could not fill that gap and actually meet the needs. The competent engineers in South Africa are underutilized or totally excluded from running the infrastructure of South Africa. And the selection process of the people who end up being employed in the engineering sections of state-owned companies, municipalities, provincial government departments and national government departments are largely not enough or senior enough or experienced enough to do the work, and the most competent people are not employed there. So that is what we mean by lack of capacity. And the budgeting that is supposed to go to maintenance of infrastructure and also the creation of new infrastructure is not being handled properly, and wrong projects are launched, projects that are choosing the wrong technology, or projects that are budgeted incorrectly with inflated prices and so on and so forth. So the money never becomes enough to do the job.
Yeah. I mean, Sandile, I hear what you're saying, and it's exceptionally worrying. It really is. But, you know, the excuse that we always get, and we always hear the same thing, you know, with the advent of democracy meant that people are no longer confined in previously apartheid spatially designated areas, which obviously lead to a lot of people coming in and moving into areas that were not necessarily, you know, managed or designed for them, and factors like migrants as well, people being confined to rural areas and then suddenly coming into cities. Population growth, can we still keep blaming this, or is it also just the fact that the maintenance is not there of the infrastructure that has already been there? I mean, we're seeing that with electricity supply. So how much can we attribute to the fact that nothing's being repaired, but also to population growth at the same time?
I would actually take population growth out of this discussion completely. First of all, most of us know that every ESCOM project has taken at least twice the time that it should take to come on stream, to actually start working properly. And the ones that we know of, Medupi and Kusile, are not working properly, even as we speak, regardless of how much time they've spent on them. When you talk about dams, water infrastructure, water pipelines, and so on, the largest number of water projects, whether they are dams or pipelines or refurbishment of dams or repair of dams, largely all of those projects are behind schedule. So when you have not done the job, if they were saying our engineers have used every skill possible and are stretched to beyond capacity, and the need is still not being met, then we'll bring in the issue that the population maybe is too much. Let alone the fact that we know that by and large, in terms of the training of artisans, technicians, and engineers, there has been a lag. We've not been doing a good job. It's only very recently that the engineering associations are starting to say they are getting the quantities of engineers that they need. Yeah. Otherwise, artisans, a few years back, were fallen to were below the levels of artisans that we had in the 1970s, 1973. We're below that. So if your population is growing and we're not growing the number of artisans and technicians, you are definitely going to have a lot of problems.
My final question, and I know I have stolen a few minutes out of news, I just know because we were struggling to get this on, but an important one. I mean, the report also saying that it is a fallacy to assume that any real saving is achieved by reducing or diverting or not spending maintenance budgets, which we've addressed. And ESCOM is really the case in point, which has come back to bite the country. I mean, if we look back to President Thabo Mbeki admitting in 2007 that the government was wrong for not listening to ESCOM when advised to invest more in electricity to keep up with the country's growth. That was in 2007. Is it possible to fix these problems we're talking about at this stage, or is it just getting too late?
First of all, a quick one is that if you don't do repairs now, or maintenance, not repairs, to avoid maintenance and rely on doing repairs, it's 6 times more expensive. 2, the engineering capacity and even the financial capacity to attend to the problems we have exists in South Africa. If investors and financiers of infrastructure projects are convinced that we've given our engineers enough space to man our municipalities, to be there in the state-owned institutions, that they are actually there, physically there, and that our professional engineering associations are actually doing their jobs without hindrance, investment in infrastructure will flow easily and quickly. So that it can be solved. If we want to solve it, if our politicians want to solve it, Thabo Mbeki was telling the truth because he himself had failed and refused to pay attention to our engineers.
We leave it there. Sandile, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us here on the program. Sandile Swana is a municipal governance and finance consultant discussing the state of the country's infrastructure. Unfortunately, not a rosy picture that painted there.